claimed he was a self-employed farrier, and I can't tell you any more than that. He joined up as a farrier, was sent overseas. He enlisted on August 22nd, 1916, and was sent overseas in February of 1917, and was attached to the No. 4 Veterinary Corps in France. And apparently he was wounded in the eye. I don't know how seriously, but I have postcards from various people saying that Donald had been wounded, and also a newspaper report that confirms his army records. But and he was repatriated home from illness and wounds, and died several months after he came home. So I never knew my my grandfather, because he was dead in 1918, a little bit before I was born, and I don't believe that Maroa, my mother, probably ever saw her father. We don't really know. If she did, she would be very, very, very young. So, because he had 2 children, she was born when he went overseas. He's the only one of the Nortons and the Pattersons that served overseas that was married and had children. From what she said, that she was pretty bitter that she had never met up with her father. Quite a number of the soldiers did die after they got home from their wounds and things like that. It was not uncommon. There were 4 other brothers served, and there's Colin is possibly the best known, mainly because he stayed at Gallipoli and is very well documented. He left quite a record behind of handwritten records that I have copies of his times at leaving on the ship from New Zealand, and his training in Egypt. And he was, although his army records do not state, he was promoted to lieutenant, which was pretty unusual to have a young Maori boy promoted to a lieutenant, and he was to be left in charge of the Nelson Mounted Regiment's horses, whilst the rest went to Gallipoli. And apparently he flatly refused and reverted to ranks. He said, "I want to go with my mates." He went with his mates and stayed there. It was the whole process was a very gung-ho type of thing. There was no fear until finally, when Colin wrote when they landed at Anzac Cove in the dark and sat under the bank. He was very excited, writing that he could hear the bullets whizzing overhead, and he wrote in a postcard home that he was heading off to have his turkey dinner and what was going to happen to the poor old Turks and so on. And in his writings, Colin had a 4-day gap that he never wrote anything, and well, he didn't. The only words he wrote was, "Nothing much happened." And so I have the history of the regiments, and I went and had a look at the regiment, and that 4 days was when the Turkish mounted a huge effort to push the Anzacs off Gallipoli with massive losses, Turkish losses. And it was so bad that they had to call a 1-day truce so they could bury the dead, and that's when Colin said nothing much happened. So he was a change. His writings changed after that, and he was gung-ho and it was all semi-fun, sniping at each other, and his writings changed, and I thought, and it won't sound very nice, he became a killer. Suddenly he was used to it, and it was quite horrible. And but I dare say that's war. And anyway, he was killed, got shot between the eyes. My step-grandfather, who married Donald's wife after he died, was with Colin, and I was only 15 when we were digging post holes on the farm. I'd just left school, and Nunks, as we call my step-grandfather, said to me, "I was standing beside your uncle when he got shot between the eyes." And I was just too young. I didn't want to know about it. And that history, to me, he wanted to talk about it, but I wasn't old enough to take it all in, and didn't want to, which I regret now, but that can't be helped. 400 odd New Zealand soldiers killed on Gallipoli have got known graves, and Colin is one that does. It's just really very, very lucky. He's buried in the Canterbury Regiment Cemetery, and there's 22 soldiers buried in there. That's a very, very small cemetery, and it's right by Anzac Cove, and he was killed number 1 outpost just above, to the left of the graves, and they just brought him down. He was obviously dying, and when he died, they buried him at 9:30 next morning. So, and all his friends were pulled out of the front line and taken to his service, which was pretty special. But we took, as I said, we've been there twice. First time we took Heather and Joe Heberley from down the Sounds, and our daughter was married to their son, and then we took our daughter and their son back to show them. Anyway, he remained there, which is pretty sad. It was good, for want of a better word. I thought I'd be terribly emotional, and I wasn't. Angry would be a good word at the stupidity of the English and their, for want of idiot generals. The stupidity of Mr. Churchill, and causing this chaos over there. I did get very angry, and the craziness of landing where they did, you had to crawl up some of the hills that they fought up, and it was quite ridiculous. The Turkish people, and I certainly admire them for it, and I certainly would not. They love the Australians and the New Zealanders. They accept us. They are scathing of the English and their efforts, and I find it quite fascinating that people would welcome you back when you should never have been there. But that's what happens. Alan went to Gallipoli. He joined 10 days after Colin did, because Colin joined 13 days after war was declared, and which was quite an effort, because they got on their horses and rode from Whakapapa in the pouring rain, stayed overnight in Rye Valley at a sister's place, and then rode over to Nelson and joined up. And Alan joined up 10 days after Colin. He didn't go with the regiment when they first went to Gallipoli, because he was sick with dysentery. And Colin wrote a postcard saying that Alan can't come, he'll be here in a week or two because he's sick with dysentery. Alan wrote many postcards, when I say many, 10 postcards back to New Zealand, and the one that his war records, as far as I can decipher, don't ever mention that he went to Gallipoli. He did go to Gallipoli. He wrote a postcard while on the boat just offshore from Gallipoli before he landed. He was waiting for night to fall before they landed. So he was there. He's got records of the horse, who he brought it from in Whakapapa and how much he paid for it. And of course the horse had to stay behind when the war was over. So yes, they did take their own horses. Well, Colin did. There's a record of that. I also have a copy of his pay book, and he, as a sergeant, he received the princely sum of 70 cents a day, of which he had to put 35 cents he wasn't allowed. That was to pay for things back home. And when he reverted to ranks, his pay dropped to 10 cents a day. Out of the 5 Pattersons and 4 Nortons who served, Alan is the only one that was not recorded as being physically wounded by a gunshot wound, but he was sent home because repatriated home for sickness. Literally 8 of them received gunshot or shrapnel wounds, and 2 were killed in action and 1 died later on. It's a heavy price for Patrick's and Tangitu's kids to die for, isn't it? He had served in the 3rd Waikato militia in the Maori War up in the Waikato when the government in its wisdom confiscated 1 million acres and blah blah blah, and he sent several letters back about his experiences up there, and I've always wondered then, these boys, what did Harriet think of Matthew actually physically going up to fight against the Maori, and he then goes and marries into the Maori, which is quite interesting in itself, and then his boys go away and fight for the English. So it can get, it shows the evolving times and how they must have adapted, I suppose. The Norton boys all joined at Blenheim on the same day, and they're quite unique in the fact, I believe they're quite unique, is that they all have consecutive army numbers. Harry starts at, his number is 40,236, and it works up to 239 of the boys, which I suggest is unusual. 3, excluding Harry, 3 were sent to France on the same day. They all saw active service. Harry Norton was killed just before the war ended, which he was killed on August the 24th, 1918, when his regiment was following tanks that were attacking positions. I think it was near Grevillers. He's buried there anyway, so it would have been very close. And then there you have Manuel or Wilfred or Emmanuel or Manny as they knew him. He was sick, but he was also had a gunshot wound in the right shoulder and was out of action for quite some time. After he recovered from his war wound, he was admitted back to hospital with scabies, of all things, and he never returned to active duty. So he suffered quite heavily, and his number was 40,237. And so then you have Richard, his number was 40,238. There's very little about Richard. but we do know he was wounded in the arms and legs, and he was in hospital for quite some time, but his records don't indicate whether he ever returned to active duty, and was returned home in July of 1919. Then there is Timothy, the last of the Norton brothers. His number was 40239, and he was seriously wounded in the face in April the 5th and, in 1918, and the wound was serious enough that he was no longer physically able to serve and was sent home. So the Norton brothers, for their bravery, suffered fairly heavily too, and they are Patrick Norton and Tangitu's grandchildren, and I've always wondered, Patrick, as I've said, was a convicted by the English in Ireland and sent out, and wondered what he would have thought with his grandchildren and great-grandchildren fighting for somebody he probably didn't have a great deal of time for. And probably I'd like to meet up with Patrick one day and ask him what was his thoughts about that. Harry Norton, who died in 1905, 10 years before he was killed, his father, James, was knocked overboard in the middle of Cook Strait when they had attached himself to a whale, and he got knocked overboard anyway, and his father couldn't swim, didn't have a hope. And Harry dived in and supported him while they cut the whale loose, turned around and came back, and his bravery was recognised by the people of Blenheim, of all things, and they held quite a big thing and gave him a gold medal and for his efforts. And the Blenheim mayor's closing remarks when he gave Harry his gold medal was that, "I hope that the spirit you have shown will continue throughout your life." And look, he'd already shown that he was brave enough, and then gets himself killed, which he didn't want to, of course. But I have a newspaper report saying that the particular newspaper in England has recorded that the whole population of this island has joined the army to fight for the king and country, which is quite unusual. So yes, they were whalers. So they were third generation whalers, Patrick, of course, and their father and themselves. And what is interesting with the Norton family is that there was a Norton that shot the last whale that was ever shot in New Zealand, and I think in 1964 when Pirano's closed down, and they had a continuous whaling. The Norton family had a continuous association with whaling from literally the start to the finish in New Zealand.